This isn't a story about one company winning. It's about a monopoly war that chewed up rivals, workers, towns, and the rules at the same time. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil like a control room full of invisible switches. And the day America finally saw the wiring, the machine was already reaching for its next target. Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it. In the 1860s, oil was still a raw gamble. Western Pennsylvania was pumping crude that smelled like money and burned like a curse. Refiners chased kerosene because the country wanted light. But refining wasn't elegant. It was heat, pressure, acids, barrels, and constant risk. A small mistake could mean a fire. A small delay could mean a missed payment. And a missed payment could mean the end. Most people looked at this chaos and saw opportunity. Rockefeller looked at it and saw waste. He started as a clerk and then a commission merchant in Cleveland. That job trained him on invoices, credit, interest, shipping schedules, and the quiet power of a banknote. He learned something early that mattered more than any still. In a volatile market, the winner isn't always the best producer. It's the one who can survive a bad month without begging. By 1863, Rockefeller put money into a refinery partnership. He wasn't the man standing over the still, judging the cut by smell and temperature. He was the man who wanted the plant to run steady, buy supplies cheaper, and sell output on time. He tracked losses that other owners treated as normal. Leaky barrels, bad staves, poor storage, late rail cars. Every tiny leak became a number. Every number became a decision. Cleveland was his advantage. It wasn't the oil fields, but it had what mattered: rail lines, access to Lake Erie, banks, and space. From Cleveland, you could pull crude in, refine it, and ship kerosene out to big markets. And in that setup, one expense towered over the rest: transportation. Railroads set the rates. Rates set the price. Price decided who got the orders. If your freight cost was lower than your rivals, you could cut prices and still live. If your freight cost was higher, you could make the best kerosene in America and still die broke. Rockefeller built Standard Oil around that reality. In 1870, he and his partners incorporated Standard Oil of Ohio. He wasn't alone, and that matters. Samuel Andrews knew the refining process. Henry Flagler understood credit, leverage, and the kind of agreements that never show up in public speeches. Rockefeller sat in the middle, not as a celebrity, but as a manager who treated the whole industry like a ledger that could be rewritten. Then came the first moment that made America realize this wasn't normal competition. In early 1872, a secret arrangement surfaced with a name that sounded technical enough to hide a crime: the South Improvement Company. The public argument was efficiency. The private effect was domination. The plan offered certain refiners big rebates on railroad shipping, while everyone else paid full price. And the ugliest detail was the drawback: a kickback tied to competitor shipments. You didn't just lose to the favored group. Your own barrels helped fund them. When that story leaked, oil towns erupted. Producers threatened boycotts. Independent refiners held meetings and demanded the scheme die. The railroads backed away, and the plan collapsed fast. On paper, it looked like a victory for the independents. But something else happened in Cleveland while everyone was focused on the scandal. Rockefeller learned that the railroads didn't need one formal conspiracy to tilt the field. They only needed the right customer, the right volume, and the right secrecy. And once your rivals believed the rates were rigged, fear did part of the work for you. Their bankers got nervous. Their suppliers tightened terms. Their customers started looking for stable partners. Standard moved refinery by refinery. Owners were offered a choice that didn't feel like a choice. Sell now, take cash or stock, and walk away. Or stay and fight a company that could outlast you, undercut you, and still smile at the bank. No soldiers, no raids, just contracts, freight, and credit. Within weeks, Cleveland's independent refining scene started to vanish. Later, people called it the Cleveland Massacre because the speed was the point. Rockefeller wasn't just buying plants. He was buying silence. He was removing options. And here's what makes the title real. This wasn't only Standard Oil versus rival refiners. This was Standard Oil versus the country's idea of a fair market. Because once you can decide who ships, who gets credit, and who gets priced out, you aren't competing inside America anymore. You're competing against it. After Cleveland, the pattern spread like a stain. Standard didn't announce a takeover. It offered paperwork, a purchase agreement, a stock swap, a quiet promise that you could leave with something instead of nothing. If you refused, the pressure didn't look like violence. It looked like business conditions changing overnight. A rival refinery would get a new freight quote, higher. Another would suddenly ship slower. Cars delayed. Barrels sitting in the sun. Buyers waiting. Then the bank would call, not to threaten, but to ask questions. The same questions every owner hated. Are you liquid? Are you safe? Are you still shipping? Rockefeller understood that fear travels faster than oil. A refinery lives on rhythm. Crude arrives. Kerosene leaves. Cash returns. Break the rhythm, and the plant starts eating itself. Standard's advantage wasn't just cheaper shipping, it was scale. When you buy more barrels, you pay less per barrel. When you order more acid, you pay less per gallon. When your stills run steady, your workers stay trained, and your yield stays predictable. Those savings became a weapon. Here's the part most people miss. A price war doesn't have to be everywhere. It only has to be where your rival sells. Standard could drop kerosene prices in one city and keep them higher in another. If an independent tried to expand, the price would fall right where they landed. Independents called it unfair. Standard called it efficiency. Rockefeller didn't argue in public. He counted. If selling below cost for weeks could force a sale, it was cheaper than a long fight. Inside the refineries, the machine got tighter. Output was standardized. Quality was monitored. Losses were hunted. Products that used to be discarded were turned into revenue. Lubricating oils, paraffin wax, byproducts that helped keep cash flowing when kerosene prices swung. This is where the war stops feeling like a rivalry and starts feeling like a system swallowing a system. Standard wasn't just buying plants, it was buying storage tanks, tank cars, barrel works, docks, terminals, the boring parts that decide whether you can operate. And it kept its hands clean through distance. Standard often didn't need its name on the door. Ownership could hide behind local firms, friendly directors, and quiet partnerships. To an outsider, it looked like competition was still alive. Inside the trade, everyone knew who controlled the switchboard. Rockefeller's personality mattered here because he built the culture. He demanded secrecy. He demanded discipline. He demanded loyalty to the plan over loyalty to any one plant. His executives weren't told to win arguments. They were told to win routes. The railroads were the first battlefield, and that was no accident. Rail presidents and old money financiers controlled the arteries. Standard learned how to speak their language. volume, predictability, leverage. It didn't have to own the rails to benefit from them. It only had to become the customer railroads could not afford to lose. By the late 1870s, the oil business was changing shape. Independent owners still existed, but many were boxed in. Some were forced into deals. Some went under. Some sold and kept quiet, because a loud loser could scare the next seller. And then a new threat appeared, the kind that could break railroad power: pipelines. At first, pipelines looked like liberation, a way for producers to move oil without begging the rails, a way for independents to breathe again. But Standard didn't see a threat. It saw the next choke point, and once Standard focused on a choke point, it rarely stayed free for long. Pipelines looked like a way out. If producers could move crude by pipe, they wouldn't have to beg the railroads. And if independents could feed their own refineries, Standard's freight advantage would finally have a ceiling. So in late 1878, a group tied to the Bradford Field organized the Tidewater Pipe Company with one blunt goal: move oil east without letting Standard choose the price. The plan sounded impossible at the time: a long-distance line over mountains, through rights-of-way, with pumping stations that had to work day and night. By May 28, 1879, Tidewater's pumping engines began operating. The line used 6-inch wrought iron pipe and ran about 103 miles from the fields near Corryville to Williamsport, where the oil could be loaded onto the Reading Railroad for shipment to eastern markets. It was designed for about 6,000 barrels a day. The Reading Railroad even subscribed $250,000 in stock because it wanted oil traffic that had been locked away. To independents, this wasn't just engineering. It was a declaration of war. If Tidewater worked, Standard couldn't choke them with freight rates the same way. Standard understood that instantly. Rockefeller didn't need to stand at a pump station to see the threat. A pipeline bypasses the gate. If you can't control the gate, you control the pipeline. The conflict that followed was pure Gilded Age. No uniforms, no speeches, just leverage, capital, and the ability to outlast pain. Tidewater needed steady flow, steady credit, and steady buyers. Standard could attack all three without ever touching the pipe. Price moved first. Standard had the scale to cut kerosene prices in targeted markets, not everywhere, just where an independent needed oxygen. If the independent matched the price, they bled cash. If they didn't match it, they lost customers and looked weak to the bank. The war wasn't fought in one headline. It was fought in weekly balance sheets. Then came the harder truth for independents. Building a pipe is one thing. Keeping it supplied, insured, defended, and financed is another. Every mile creates a new point of vulnerability. Landowners demand more. Local officials stall permits. A pump fails, and the whole line backs up. In that kind of system, a rumor can be as destructive as a break. Standard didn't just adapt. It reorganized around pipelines as the new backbone. In 1881, Standard formed the National Transit Company to own and operate its pipeline network. One of the key figures tied to this push was Henry H. Rogers, who became known inside Standard for thinking in long lines and choke points, not single plants. This changed the war's geometry. Railroads were still important, but now Standard's preferred method of transport was pipe. The monopoly wasn't only a pricing weapon anymore, it was infrastructure. If Standard controlled the lines, it could decide which crude reached which refinery and when. That meant the fight was no longer refinery versus refinery. It was system versus system. And as Standard stretched across states, Rockefeller hit another problem. States were starting to push back against giant combinations. Different laws, different limits, different ways to force a company to break itself into pieces on paper. Rockefeller's answer was a structure that looked legal and felt untouchable. On January 2, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was created when dozens of companies' shares were pooled under a small set of trustees. The trust agreement effectively gave one central brain control over a sprawling body, even if the limbs had different names in different states. This is the moment Standard Oil versus America stops being a regional oil feud and becomes a national question. Because a trust like that doesn't just win markets. It tests the country's ability to regulate power that can move faster than its laws. And for a while, it worked. The system kept growing. The switches stayed hidden. The paperwork stayed clean. Until Americans started asking why the same invisible hand kept showing up in every pipeline, every rate, and every ruined competitor. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil wasn't just a dominant refiner. It was the rule book. If you were an independent, you could still run a plant. But you were running it inside someone else's weather system. And the country started to notice. States began asking a simple question. If one group can control prices, routes, and supply, what's left of a free market? The problem was proof. The power was real, but it lived inside contracts, committees, and companies that didn't share a single name. In 1882, the trust structure had already solved that problem for Standard. It pooled control under a small set of trustees, even while the operating companies stayed scattered across different states. On the ground, it meant the same people could steer dozens of firms as if they were one. So lawmakers tried to build a weapon that could hit the whole structure. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to target unlawful restraints of trade and monopolies. On paper, it was a national line in the sand. In reality, it was the start of a long chase. The first big legal fracture came from Ohio, the state where the trust's roots ran deep. Court records from the era show Ohio attacked the trust arrangement itself, arguing it was an illegal combination. In 1892, the Supreme Court of Ohio ordered the Standard Oil Trust dissolved. If you picture that as a dramatic shutdown, it wasn't. The stills didn't go cold. The tank cars didn't stop. Standard did what it had trained itself to do. It adjusted the paperwork. The trust, as a formal object, was broken apart. But the same community of interest remained. The operating companies were reorganized, separated on the surface, and coordinated underneath. Even contemporary observers and later historians noted how the system effectively continued to function from its New York center. This is where the war turns into legal noir. America could see the effects. A rival fails. A market swings. Prices behave strangely in one city, then normalize in another. But pinning responsibility on a single entity becomes harder because the entity keeps changing shape. Standard's next move came from a place that sounds boring, but changed everything. Corporate law. New Jersey altered its incorporation rules in ways that made it easier for one company to hold stock in many others across state lines. Standard seized the opening. In 1899, Standard Oil of New Jersey became the holding company that tied the scattered pieces back together under one roof again. Same machine, new casing. And Rockefeller's role shifts right here, in a way that adds to the confusion. By the mid-1890s, he stopped showing up daily, and by 1897, he had retired from day-to-day control. But he stayed a major shareholder, and the organization he built kept operating on the habits he demanded. Management power moved to executives like John D. Archbold, who kept the system running while Rockefeller stayed in the background. So from the outside, it got messy. Politicians wanted a villain in the room. The public wanted a single company to point at. But Standard was now a network of boards, stock certificates, and independent names that all seemed to lean the same direction. That's the trap Standard set for America. A monopoly you can feel, but can't easily prove. And then someone started trying to prove it anyway. Not with speeches, but with receipts, contracts, and a story that could connect the dots in plain English. The first real counterattack didn't come from a statehouse or a courtroom. It came from a writer who treated Standard Oil like a crime scene. In 1902, journalist Ida Tarbell began publishing a serialized investigation in McClure's magazine, built from interviews, public records, and corporate documents. 2 years later, it was released as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. She wasn't writing theory. She was connecting dots, rebates, drawbacks, quiet buyouts. The way independent names kept circling back to the same center. What made it dangerous was the tone. It didn't sound like a political speech. It sounded like someone reading the receipts out loud. Newspapers talked about Standard differently after that. Politicians talked about trusts differently too. The country was already uneasy about corporate power, and Standard was the cleanest symbol of it. The monopoly wasn't just big. It was disciplined. It looked legitimate from the outside and predatory from the inside. Standard's defense was always the same. We lowered prices. We improved quality. We brought stability to a chaotic industry. And to be fair, there was truth in that. But the question America kept coming back to was simpler. Did Standard win by being better, or by making it impossible to compete? By this point, Rockefeller himself was harder to grab. He had stepped away from day-to-day control by the late 1890s, even though he remained the biggest shareholder, and the system still ran on his methods. That made the war feel even more unfair. The machine kept moving, and the most famous man behind it was no longer at the controls. Then the federal government finally made the fight official. In 1906, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Act. Court filings and later summaries describe it as an attempt to prove a long pattern of restraint of trade and monopoly in petroleum. This wasn't one bad contract. It was a case about the whole design. That's where the thriller tightens, because a monopoly doesn't confess. You have to prove it by showing the same behavior repeating across markets, across years, across different company names. Contracts that look normal until you compare them. Price drops that look like competition until you see how targeted they are. Ownership charts that look messy until you trace who votes the stock. Standard still had its strengths. It had lawyers. It had money. It had time. And it had something even better: complexity. But complexity is only protection until a court decides it's a mask. In 1909, a federal court found Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Act and ordered dissolution, setting up the fight for the Supreme Court. Now the war had a finish line, and Standard knew it. Because if the Supreme Court agreed, it wouldn't mean a fine. It wouldn't mean a promise to behave. It would mean the one thing Rockefeller built his empire to avoid: a forced separation, a machine with its switches ripped apart. Standard appealed, and the case climbed toward a single room where the entire century's argument about monopoly would be tested. And the question wasn't just whether Standard broke the law. The question was whether America could still break Standard. The question was whether a law written for a free market could reach a machine built out of contracts. That law was the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890 to target trusts and restraints of trade. And in 1906, the federal government finally took the shot it had been lining up for years, suing Standard Oil under that act. By the time the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, the fight wasn't just legal, it was physical. Pipelines, terminals, tank cars, storage, routes. Standard's lawyers warned the judges that the oil network wasn't a set of separate companies at all, but one connected system. In their filings, they pointed to a pipeline empire measured in the tens of thousands of miles and argued that cutting it into pieces would make the whole thing impossible to operate. That was the tell. On May 15, 1911, the court ruled that the Standard Combination was an unreasonable restraint of trade under the Sherman Act, and it affirmed the need to break the structure apart. The empire wasn't going to be fined and forgiven. It was going to be separated. And separated didn't mean a dramatic moment on a factory floor. It meant accountants with maps, lawyers with ownership charts, clerks splitting boards of directors, assets, contracts, and routes. A single command structure turned into a stack of competing organizations, each with its own books, its own incentives, its own survival instinct. Britannica describes the remedy in plain terms. The New Jersey Holding Company was ordered to divest itself of its major holdings, 33 companies in all. That's what the end of a monopoly looks like in America. Not smoke, paper. For a while, it must have felt unreal inside the headquarters at 26 Broadway. For decades, this was where the system's decisions could travel outward like electricity. Rail terms, pipeline priorities, pricing logic, who got served first and who got squeezed. The building was just stone and offices, but the country treated it like a control room. Now the control room was losing its switches. John D. Rockefeller wasn't walking the floors day to day anymore, but the machine still carried his fingerprints. It was built on discipline, secrecy, and leverage. It treated transportation and credit like weapons. It treated competition like a problem to be engineered away. And here's the part that makes the title land the way it should. This war crushed everyone, but not equally. Independents were crushed first. Many didn't lose because their kerosene was worse. They lost because they couldn't ship, couldn't borrow, couldn't survive a targeted price cut long enough to fight back. Whole towns were bent around refinery jobs and oil traffic, and when the traffic moved, the town shrank with it. Workers were crushed in a quieter way. Because a monopoly doesn't need a flexible labor market, it needs a predictable one. Schedules, discipline, standardization, and the constant pressure to run steady. When the machine was whole, you worked inside it. When it fractured, you worked through the chaos it left behind. And America was crushed in the sense that it learned a brutal lesson. The law could win, but it would always be late. The machine could move faster than outrage, faster than state lines, faster than public understanding. Even the Supreme Court, in its own language, admitted it had to reason through what counted as unreasonable, because the old definitions weren't enough. So the ruling didn't just end Standard Oil as a single organism. It defined how antitrust would work for the next century. If you want one last image to hold on to, don't picture the judges. Picture the industrial silence, a refinery gate with a new chain, a tank farm where the paperwork changed, but the smell didn't. A telegraph line that no longer carried one set of orders for the entire country. A desk at 26 Broadway, where the same map hangs on the wall, but the pins now belong to different hands. The Monopoly War ends not with a bang, but with a system losing its single heartbeat. Like the video, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from? This channel is where we trace the real machines behind American history. If you watched the video to the end, did this story surprise you?